The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Blackwood mansion as Rosa wiped down the crystal chandeliers in the grand foyer. She had been working here for only 3 weeks, but already she could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't just the size of the place that made her uncomfortable. It was the silence. The kind of silence that came from people being too afraid to speak above a whisper. Rosa adjusted the baby carrier strapped to her chest, making sure little Sophia was comfortable. The 6-month-old had been fussy this morning, probably sensing her mother's nervousness about this job. When Rosa first applied to work at the Blackwood estate, she never imagined she would be allowed to bring her baby to work. But the agency had been desperate to fill the position, and Rosa had been honest about her situation. She was a single mother with no family nearby and couldn't afford childcare on a maid's salary. The other staff members had made it clear from day one that bringing a baby to work was unusual. James, the head butler, had given her a long lecture about maintaining professionalism and keeping the child quiet at all times. The security guards barely acknowledged her existence, and the other housekeepers whispered among themselves whenever she walked by with Sophia. Rosa understood their attitude. This wasn't just any wealthy family's home. This was the residence of Robert Blackwood, one of the most powerful businessmen in the state. His company controlled half the real estate in the city, and his influence reached into politics, media, and finance. People said he could destroy careers with a single phone call. Even the grocery store clerks in town knew not to keep him waiting when he shopped. The mansion itself felt like a monument to that power. 37 rooms spread across 3 floors, with gardens that required a team of 6 landscapers to maintain. The garage housed 12 luxury cars, each worth more than Rosa would earn in 5 years. Every surface gleamed with expensive polish. Every painting on the walls was an original, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. But despite all this wealth, the house felt cold. Rosa had worked in wealthy homes before, but those families had warmth, laughter, and life in their spaces. Here even the air seemed thick with tension. The staff moved like ghosts, appearing only when needed and disappearing the moment their tasks were complete. Robert Blackwood himself was exactly what Rosa had expected from the stories she'd heard. Tall and imposing, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they looked at. He dressed in expensive suits even at home and carried himself like a man who had never been told no. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. His wife, Victoria, was his second marriage. She was 15 years younger than Robert, with the kind of polished beauty that came from the best salons and personal trainers money could buy. Victoria spent most of her time on charity committees and social events, always perfectly dressed and always carrying herself like she was posing for a magazine cover. She rarely spoke to the staff directly, preferring to give instructions through James. Then there was Tommy, Robert's 8-year-old son from his first marriage. The boy was quiet in a way that seemed unnatural for a child his age. Rosa often saw him sitting alone in the library or wandering the halls by himself. He had a collection of expensive toys that most children would dream of, but Rosa noticed he rarely played with them. Instead, he seemed to spend his time watching the adults around him, as if trying to figure out some complicated puzzle. Rosa's heart went out to the boy. She had grown up poor, but her childhood had been filled with love and laughter. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to support them, but she always made time to read bedtime stories and help with homework. Tommy had everything money could buy, but Rosa rarely saw him smile. The other staff members had warned Rosa about getting too friendly with the family.
"Keep your head down and do your work," James had told her.
Mr. Blackwood doesn't like chatty employees. The last maid who tried to make conversation with Mrs. Blackwood was let go the same day. Rosa had taken the warning to heart, but it was hard to ignore Tommy when he looked so lonely. A few times she had caught him staring at baby Sophia with curiosity. Once, when Rosa was dusting the library, Tommy had quietly asked if the baby ever cried. Rosa had whispered back that Sophia was usually a happy baby, and Tommy had nodded seriously before walking away. The house rules were strict and numerous. Staff were not allowed in certain areas during family time. Personal phone calls were forbidden during work hours. The refrigerator in the kitchen was off limits except for designated break times. Any broken items, no matter how small, had to be reported immediately to James, who would then decide whether to inform Mr. Blackwood. Rosa had learned these rules the hard way during her first week when she accidentally knocked over a small decorative vase while dusting. It wasn't valuable, probably cost less than $20, but James had treated it like a major incident. He had made Rosa fill out a detailed report and had spoken to her in the tone usually reserved for serious offenses. The pay was good, better than Rosa could find anywhere else in town. The work wasn't particularly difficult, just time-consuming and detailed, but the atmosphere made every day feel like walking through a minefield. Rosa found herself checking and double-checking every task, terrified of making a mistake that could cost her this job. She needed this work desperately. The apartment she shared with Sophia was small and barely affordable even with this salary. Before this job, Rosa had been working at a hotel, but the hours had been impossible to manage with a baby. Night shifts meant leaving Sophia with neighbors she barely knew, and day shifts meant bringing Sophia to a daycare she couldn't really afford. When the employment agency had called about the Blackwood position, Rosa had been skeptical. Jobs that paid this well usually came with impossible requirements or unbearable conditions, but when they mentioned that she might be able to bring her baby to work, Rosa knew she had to try. Now, 3 weeks later, Rosa was still getting used to the strange rhythm of life in the mansion. The family kept to a strict schedule that the staff was expected to memorize and accommodate. Mr. Blackwood left for his office at exactly 7:30 each morning and returned at 6:15 each evening. Mrs. Blackwood had her yoga instructor on Mondays and Wednesdays, her personal trainer on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and her hair appointment every Friday. Tommy's schedule was just as rigid: private tutoring sessions every morning, tennis lessons twice a week, and piano practice every evening. The boy rarely had time for just being a child, and Rosa wondered if anyone had ever asked him what he wanted to do with his days. Today felt different somehow. Rosa couldn't put her finger on what had changed, but there was an energy in the air that made her more nervous than usual. Mrs. Blackwood had been on 3 phone calls before 9 in the morning, her voice sharp and frustrated. Mr. Blackwood had slammed his office door earlier, something Rosa had never seen him do before. Even Tommy seemed more withdrawn than usual. When Rosa had seen him at breakfast, he had been picking at his food instead of eating, staring out the window at the swimming pool in the backyard. Rosa finished cleaning the chandelier and moved on to polishing the marble staircase railings. Sophia had fallen asleep in her carrier, her tiny fist curled against Rosa's chest. These quiet moments were precious to Rosa. Despite the stress of working in this house, she was grateful to have her daughter close to her during the day. As she worked, Rosa couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The mansion felt like a pot of water just beginning to boil, with pressure building beneath the surface. She had learned to trust her instincts about people and places, and right now, every instinct was telling her to pay attention. Little did Rosa know that in just a few hours, all the careful rules and silent fears that governed life in the Blackwood mansion would be shattered by a single moment of crisis that would change everything. The afternoon sun was blazing hot when the Blackwood family gathered by the pool for what was supposed to be a rare moment of family time. Robert had finished his important conference calls early, and Victoria had decided to take advantage of the beautiful weather by having lunch served on the pool deck. Rosa was working in the poolside cabana, organizing the expensive pool towels and cleaning the outdoor furniture. Sophia was awake now, making soft baby sounds as she looked around at the bright blue water and white umbrellas. This was one of Rosa's favorite areas to work, because it felt more open and peaceful than the inside of the mansion. The pool itself was impressive, stretching almost the length of a tennis court with crystal clear water that sparkled in the sunlight. Stone sculptures decorated the corners, and perfectly trimmed hedges provided privacy from the neighboring estates. Everything about it screamed luxury and careful planning. Tommy sat at the edge of the pool, dangling his feet in the water while the adults talked. Rosa noticed he was wearing his regular clothes instead of swimming trunks, even though it was hot enough for a swim. She had learned over the past few weeks that Tommy rarely used the pool, despite living right next to it. Robert was on his phone again, pacing back and forth as he discussed some business deal. His voice carried across the water, sharp and demanding as he negotiated terms with whoever was on the other end. Victoria sat under an umbrella, scrolling through her tablet and occasionally making comments about some charity event she was planning. The household staff was scattered around the pool area, each focused on their own tasks. James stood near the outdoor kitchen, directing the servers who were setting up lunch. Two security guards, Mike and Tony, were positioned at different points around the property, keeping their usual watchful eye on everything. Carlos, the pool maintenance worker, was checking chemical levels and skimming leaves from the water. Rosa had noticed something about the way the staff behaved around the family. Everyone moved carefully like they were walking on thin ice. Conversation stopped when Robert came near. Eyes were kept down when Victoria passed by. Even Tommy seemed to make the adults nervous, as if they were afraid of saying or doing something wrong around the boss's son. It was this atmosphere of fear that would prove so dangerous in the moments to come. Tommy had been sitting quietly for almost an hour, listening to his father's phone calls and watching his stepmother work on her tablet. Rosa could see the restlessness building in the boy's small frame. He was only 8 years old, and expecting him to sit still for long periods seemed unfair. But that was the way things worked in the Blackwood household. Children were expected to behave like small adults. The accident happened so quickly that afterward, no one could agree on exactly how it started. Tommy had been reaching for something that had fallen into the pool, maybe a leaf or a small toy. He leaned forward, stretching his arm toward the water. The stone edge of the pool was wet from splashing, and his foot slipped. One moment he was sitting safely on the side, and the next moment he was tumbling headfirst into the deep end. The splash wasn't particularly loud, but it was enough to make several people look up. What they saw sent ice through their veins. Tommy was flailing in the water, his eyes wide with panic. It became immediately clear that despite living in a house with a pool, the boy had never learned to swim properly. His head bobbed above the surface for a few seconds as he struggled to stay afloat. His mouth opened to call for help, but instead of words, water rushed in. He went under, came back up coughing and sputtering, then went under again. Carlos, the pool worker, was the closest to Tommy when he fell in. He looked up from his chemical testing kit and saw the boy struggling. For a moment, he started to move toward the pool edge. Then he stopped. Carlos was an illegal immigrant who had worked hard to get this job. Getting involved in an emergency with the boss's son could go wrong in so many ways. What if he was blamed for the accident? What if he got sued? What if he made things worse? Mike, one of the security guards, was the next to notice. He was trained in emergency response and knew basic first aid. His first instinct was to jump in and help. But Mike hesitated too. He had seen what happened to employees who overstepped their boundaries in this household. Mr. Blackwood was notorious for firing people who acted without permission. What if the family blamed him for Tommy falling in the first place? What if they said he wasn't watching carefully enough? James, the head butler, saw the situation developing from across the deck. As the senior staff member, he knew he should take charge. But James had worked for wealthy families for 20 years, and he had learned that the wrong move in a crisis could end a career. He looked around frantically, hoping to see Robert or Victoria taking control of the situation. But Robert was still on his phone with his back turned, and Victoria was focused on her tablet with earbuds in. Tony, the other security guard, noticed the commotion and started moving toward the pool. But he was too far away to reach Tommy quickly, and like the others, he found himself freezing as he calculated the risks of acting without clear orders from the family. Precious seconds ticked by as Tommy continued to struggle in the water. Each time he surfaced, he seemed weaker and more panicked. The adults who were paid to protect and serve the family stood paralyzed by fear of the very people they worked for. This was the terrible irony of the Blackwood household. Robert had created an environment where his employees were so afraid of making mistakes that they couldn't act decisively even in a life-threatening emergency. The same fear that kept the house running smoothly was now preventing anyone from saving his son. Tommy's struggles were becoming more desperate. He managed to surface again, gasping for air and reaching toward the pool edge, but it was too far away. His clothes were weighing him down and exhaustion was setting in. The panic in his eyes was unmistakable as he realized he couldn't keep himself afloat much longer. Carlos finally started moving toward the pool, but he was still hesitating, unsure of what to do. Mike took a step forward, then stopped again. James was looking around frantically, trying to get Robert's attention without interrupting his important phone call. It was becoming clear that every second of delay was making the situation more dangerous. Tommy was a small boy, and drowning could happen frighteningly fast. But the culture of fear that Robert had built into his household was proving stronger than basic human instinct to help a child in danger. Rosa was folding towels in the cabana when she heard the commotion. At first, she thought it was just the normal sounds of people by a pool, but something about the urgency in the voices made her look up. What she saw made her blood run cold. Tommy was in the water, clearly struggling and in serious trouble. But what shocked Rosa even more was seeing the adults standing around the pool, obviously aware of the emergency but not acting. She could see the conflict on their faces, the way they looked at each other as if waiting for someone else to take responsibility. Rosa didn't know much about the complicated politics of working for wealthy families. She had only been in this job for 3 weeks, but she did know something that seemed to have been forgotten by everyone else around that pool. Sometimes doing the right thing mattered more than keeping a job. Sophia was still strapped to Rosa's chest as she dropped the towels and started running toward the pool. She could hear Tommy's weak attempts to call for help, could see him going under for longer periods between desperate gasps for air. The other staff members looked at Rosa with shock as she approached. Their faces seemed to say, "What are you doing? Don't you understand how things work here?" But Rosa wasn't thinking about how things worked. She was thinking about a little boy who was drowning, while the adults who should protect him stood frozen by their own fears. As Rosa reached the pool edge, she could see that Tommy was barely conscious, his movements becoming weaker and more uncoordinated. There was no time to wait for permission, no time to worry about consequences. In seconds, it might be too late to save him. Rosa quickly looked around at the staff members who were watching her with wide eyes. James started to say something, probably a warning about acting without authorization. But Rosa had already made her decision. She began unbuckling the baby carrier, knowing that what she was about to do would either save Tommy's life or cost her everything she had worked for. But as she looked at the boy's terrified face as he struggled to stay above water, Rosa realized that some choices were easier than others. The next few moments would test every assumption about courage, loyalty, and what really mattered when a child's life hung in the balance. Rosa's hands moved quickly to unbuckle the baby carrier as Tommy disappeared under the water again. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but her movements were steady and determined. She had grown up near a lake and had been swimming since she was younger than Tommy. More importantly, she had once taken a lifeguard training course at the community center, hoping to earn extra money during summers. "Here, take her," Rosa said urgently, thrusting Sophia toward James. The head butler looked shocked, his arms automatically reaching out to accept the baby even as his face showed complete bewilderment at what was happening. Without another word, Rosa kicked off her shoes and dove into the pool fully clothed. The water was colder than she expected, and her work uniform immediately became heavy and clingy. But Rosa pushed through the discomfort, swimming quickly toward where she had last seen Tommy. The pool was deeper than it looked from the surface, and for a terrifying moment she couldn't see the boy anywhere. Then she spotted him. Tommy was sinking toward the bottom of the pool, his eyes closed and his body limp. Rosa dove down, her lungs burning as she fought against the weight of her wet clothes. She grabbed Tommy around his chest and kicked hard toward the surface. Breaking through to air, Rosa gasped and immediately checked if Tommy was breathing. He was unconscious, his lips tinged with blue. Rosa remembered her training and knew she had to get him to the pool edge immediately. "Help me get him out," she called to the staff members who were still standing frozen around the pool. This time, Mike and Carlos snapped into action, reaching down to help pull Tommy from the water. As soon as Tommy was on the pool deck, Rosa climbed out and immediately began checking his condition. He was breathing, but barely, and water was coming from his mouth. Rosa turned him on his side and patted his back firmly, helping him cough up the pool water he had swallowed. "Someone call an ambulance," Rosa said, but James was already pulling out his phone. The butler's professional training had finally kicked in. Even though it had taken a near tragedy to overcome his fear of acting without permission, Tommy's eyes fluttered open, and he began coughing more forcefully. Rosa supported him as he sat up, continuing to bring up water. His breathing was labored but steady, and the blue tinge was leaving his lips. "You're okay, sweetheart," Rosa said softly, using the same gentle tone she used with Sophia. "Just breathe slowly. You're safe now." Tommy looked up at Rosa with confusion and fear, but also with something that might have been gratitude. He tried to speak but only managed a weak cough. Rosa kept her hand on his back, providing comfort and monitoring his breathing. It was at this moment that Robert Blackwood finally became aware of what was happening. His phone call had ended, and he turned around to find chaos by his pool. His son was soaking wet and coughing on the pool deck, surrounded by staff members. A woman he barely recognized was kneeling next to Tommy, her own clothes dripping wet. James was holding a baby and talking rapidly on his phone about medical emergencies. What the hell is going on here? Robert's voice cut through the commotion like a knife. The staff members immediately tensed up, their faces showing the fear that Rosa was only beginning to understand. James tried to explain while still holding Sophia, his words tumbling over each other as he described the accident. Mike and Carlos stepped back as if trying to become invisible. Robert's face went through several expressions as he processed what had happened. First confusion, then anger, then something that might have been fear as he realized how close he had come to losing his son. "Where's Victoria?" Robert demanded, looking around for his wife. "She's inside, sir," James replied. "She went to take a call from the charity committee right before the accident happened." Robert knelt down next to Tommy, his businessman's composure cracking as he saw his son's pale face and labored breathing. "Tommy, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Tommy nodded weakly and tried to sit up straighter. "Dad, I fell in," he whispered, his voice hoarse from coughing up water. "I couldn't swim." Robert's face darkened as the full implications of what had happened began to sink in. His son had nearly drowned in their own pool, and he hadn't even noticed because he was too busy with work. Worse, his highly paid security team and experienced staff had failed to act quickly enough to prevent the crisis. Rosa remained kneeling next to Tommy, one hand still on his back to monitor his breathing. She was acutely aware that she was soaking wet, that she had acted without permission, and that she had just thrust a baby into the hands of the head butler. But Tommy was alive and breathing, and that was all that mattered to her right now. Robert's eyes fixed on Rosa for the first time. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice sharp with the authority he was used to wielding. "I'm Rosa, sir. I work in housekeeping," she replied quietly, not looking away from Tommy. "I started 3 weeks ago." "And this is your baby?" Robert gestured toward Sophia, who was now crying in James's awkward embrace. "Yes, sir. Sophia is 6 months old." Robert stood up slowly, his mind clearly working through what had happened. His son had nearly died while Robert was 20 feet away, distracted by business. The people he paid handsomely to protect his family had hesitated when action was needed. And it was a minimum wage employee, a woman with a baby, who had risked everything to save Tommy's life. The ambulance sirens could be heard in the distance now, growing louder as they approached the mansion. Victoria appeared from inside the house, her face showing alarm as she saw the scene by the pool. "What happened? Is Tommy hurt?" she asked, rushing toward them. James quickly explained the situation again while still trying to comfort a crying Sophia. Victoria's face went pale as she understood how close they had come to tragedy. Tommy looked up at his father with tired eyes. "Dad, the lady saved me. She jumped in when I couldn't swim anymore." Robert looked down at his son, then at Rosa, who was still kneeling beside Tommy despite being soaked and exhausted. Her simple work uniform was clinging to her frame, and her hair was plastered to her head. But her attention remained focused entirely on making sure Tommy was okay. The contrast was striking. Rosa looked like exactly what she was, a working mother who cleaned houses for a living. But she had shown more courage and quick thinking in 5 minutes than his entire professional staff had managed in a crisis situation. The paramedics arrived and took over Tommy's care, checking his vital signs and asking questions about the near drowning. Rosa stepped back to give them room to work, finally accepting Sophia back from James, who looked relieved to return the baby to her mother. As the medical team worked with Tommy, Robert found himself studying Rosa. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with the kind of natural, unpolished appearance that marked her as someone who worked with her hands for a living. But there was something in her eyes that impressed him, a steadiness and determination that he rarely saw, even in his business dealings with powerful people. Tommy was declared stable and alert, though the paramedics recommended taking him to the hospital for observation. As Robert prepared to accompany his son in the ambulance, he looked back at Rosa one more time. "We'll talk when I get back," he said simply. Rosa nodded, unsure whether that was a promise or a threat. The other staff members were looking at her with expressions ranging from admiration to concern. She had broken every rule about knowing her place and not acting without permission. In the Blackwood household, that usually meant immediate termination. But as Rosa watched the ambulance drive away with Tommy safely inside, she realized she didn't regret her actions. Even if she lost this job, even if she struggled to find another one, she had done what felt right in the moment when it mattered most. James approached her as the other staff members began cleaning up the pool area. "Rosa," he said quietly, "what you did was very brave, but you should prepare yourself for Mr. Blackwood's return. He doesn't like employees who act independently even in emergencies." Rosa adjusted Sophia in her arms and looked at the pool where Tommy had almost died. "I understand," she said simply, "but I couldn't just watch him drown." James nodded slowly. "That's what I'm afraid he'll have a problem with. The fact that you did what the rest of us couldn't." As Rosa walked back toward the house to change into dry clothes, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of place she had been working in, where saving a child's life might be seen as overstepping boundaries. But she also knew that whatever happened next, she had acted according to her conscience, and sometimes that had to be enough. Robert returned from the hospital 3 hours later, his face a mask that revealed nothing about his thoughts or intentions. Tommy was going to be fine. The doctors had kept him for observation, but there was no lasting damage from his near-drowning experience. Victoria had stayed at the hospital with Tommy, leaving Robert to return home and deal with what had happened. Rosa had changed into a dry uniform and tried to continue her work, but concentration was impossible. Sophia had been fussy since the incident, picking up on her mother's stress. The other staff members kept glancing at Rosa with mixtures of sympathy and nervousness, as if she were walking toward her own execution. James had spent the afternoon making discreet phone calls, presumably reporting the incident to insurance companies and preparing damage control. Mike and Tony, the security guards, had been notably quiet, perhaps realizing that their hesitation during the emergency would not look good in any official report. When Robert's car pulled into the circular driveway, Rosa was dusting the main staircase. She heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of Robert's footsteps crossing the marble foyer. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued her work, trying to appear normal while her heart raced. "Rosa." Robert's voice carried across the foyer, formal and commanding. "My office now." Rosa carefully set down her cleaning supplies and adjusted Sophia in her carrier. Several staff members watched as she walked toward Robert's office, their faces showing the kind of sympathy usually reserved for condemned prisoners. Robert's office was a monument to power and success. Dark wood paneling covered the walls lined with awards, certificates, and photographs of Robert, with politicians and celebrities. His desk was massive, made from what looked like a single piece of mahogany, and positioned so that anyone sitting across from it would feel small and intimidated. Robert gestured for Rosa to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. She sat carefully, trying not to let Sophia's movements disturb the formal atmosphere of the room. Robert remained standing, looking out the window for a long moment before turning to face her. "Tell me what happened at the pool," he said, his voice giving away nothing about his mood or intentions. Rosa took a deep breath and recounted the events as clearly as she could. She described seeing Tommy fall in, noticing that the other staff members seemed frozen with indecision and making the choice to act. She was honest about everything, including her brief lifeguard training and her fear that Tommy might not survive if someone didn't help him immediately. Robert listened without interruption, his businessman's face revealing nothing. When Rosa finished speaking, he walked around his desk and sat down, his fingers steepled as he studied her. "Do you understand what you did today?" he asked finally. Rosa wasn't sure how to answer. "I helped Tommy when he was drowning, sir." "No," Robert said, his voice still neutral. "You did what my entire security team failed to do. You did what my house manager, who has 20 years of experience, couldn't do. You acted decisively in a crisis while people who are paid significantly more than you stood around calculating the risks." Rosa remained silent, unsure whether this was leading toward praise or punishment. Robert stood up again and began pacing behind his desk. "Do you know how much I pay Mike and Tony? Enough to afford nice houses and college funds for their children. Do you know how much I pay James? More than most people make in management positions. And yet when my son was dying, it was a housekeeper making minimum wage who had the courage to save him. The anger in Robert's voice was becoming clearer now, but Rosa began to realize it wasn't directed at her. I've spent years building a business empire based on the principle that fear motivates people to perform better, Robert continued. I've created an environment where everyone is so afraid of making mistakes that they strive for perfection. And today I learned that this same fear nearly cost me my son's life. Robert stopped pacing and looked directly at Rosa. Tommy told me what you said to him while you were helping him breathe. You called him sweetheart and told him he was safe. When was the last time someone in this house spoke to my son with that kind of warmth? Rosa didn't know how to respond to such a personal question. Robert seemed to be talking to himself as much as to her. My first wife, Tommy's mother, died when he was 3 years old, Robert said quietly. Since then, I've tried to give him everything money could buy. The best schools, the best tutors, the best opportunities. But I forgot to give him the one thing that doesn't cost anything: genuine care from the people around him. Robert sat back down and looked at Rosa with new attention. You've been here 3 weeks. In that time, have you spoken to Tommy? A few times, sir. Just brief conversations when I was working near him. And what did you think of him? Rosa hesitated, unsure how honest she should be. He seems lonely, sir. Like he doesn't have many people to talk to who aren't afraid of saying the wrong thing. Robert nodded slowly. And that's exactly the problem, isn't it? I've surrounded him with people who are more concerned about keeping their jobs than about his well-being. Sophia began to fuss, and Rosa gently rocked her in the carrier. Robert watched this natural motherly gesture with something that might have been envy. You have a daughter, Robert said. How do you manage to work and care for her? It's not easy, sir. Before this job, I had to leave her with neighbors or at a daycare I couldn't really afford. Being able to bring her to work has been a blessing, even though I know it's unusual. Why did you take this job? The other staff members told me you had previous experience in hospitality, so you understood what working for a wealthy family involved. Rosa considered her answer carefully. I needed the income, sir, and I hoped that if I worked hard and proved myself reliable, it might lead to better opportunities for Sophia and me. Robert was quiet for several minutes, his fingers drumming on the desk as he thought. Rosa waited, trying to read his expression for clues about what decision he was making. The other staff members are convinced I'm going to fire you, Robert said finally. They think that acting without permission, even to save someone's life, goes against the rules of this household. Rosa's stomach dropped. She had known this was a possibility, but hearing it stated so directly was still devastating. They're probably right about the old rules, Robert continued. But today made me realize that those rules nearly killed my son, so I'm going to try something different. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a leather folder. I've been thinking about what happened today and I've reached some conclusions. First, I owe you a debt that I can never fully repay. You saved Tommy's life when no one else would act. Rosa started to say that any decent person would have done the same thing, but Robert held up a hand to stop her. Second, you've shown me something that I've been missing in my approach to managing people. Fear might motivate performance, but it also paralyzes judgment. What good is a security team that's too afraid to provide security? Robert pulled some papers from the folder and set them on the desk. I'm offering you a new position, head of household operations, with a salary that will allow you to provide for Sophia's future. You'll oversee the other staff members and report directly to me. Rosa stared at the papers in shock. Sir, I don't understand. I've only been here 3 weeks. I don't have management experience. You have something more valuable than experience, Robert replied. You have judgment and courage. You can make decisions under pressure without being paralyzed by fear of consequences. That's exactly what this household needs. Sophia started crying, and Rosa automatically began the gentle bouncing motion that usually calmed her. Robert watched this with interest. There's something else, he said. I want you to spend time with Tommy, not as an employee, but as someone who can provide the kind of warmth and guidance he's been missing. Someone who isn't afraid to treat him like a normal child instead of the heir to a business empire. Rosa felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Robert was offering. Sir, this is incredibly generous, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for such responsibility. Robert smiled for the first time since she had known him.
3 hours ago, you jumped into a pool to save a drowning child without stopping to worry about qualifications or consequences.
I think you're more qualified than you realize. He slid the papers across the desk toward her. Take the weekend to think about it. But Rosa, I want you to understand something. What you did today didn't just save Tommy's life. It opened my eyes to what kind of man I've become and what kind of father I've been. Rosa looked down at the employment contract, the numbers on the salary line making her dizzy. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance to completely change her life and Sophia's future. One more thing, Robert said as Rosa stood to leave. I'll be making some changes to how this household operates. The culture of fear that nearly cost me my son ends today. I want people working here who will put what's right ahead of what's safe. As Rosa walked back through the mansion toward her duties, she realized that jumping into that pool had changed more than just Tommy's fate. It had started a transformation that would affect everyone who lived and worked in the Blackwood house. But the biggest changes were still to come. 6 months later, the Blackwood mansion felt like a completely different place. The oppressive silence that had once filled the halls had been replaced by something Rosa had never expected to hear in such a formal household: the sound of genuine laughter. Rosa stood in her new office, a bright room on the second floor that had been converted from an unused guest bedroom. Through the window she could see Tommy and Sophia playing in the garden. Well, Tommy was playing and talking to Sophia, who at 1-year-old was finally starting to take her first wobbly steps on the soft grass. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first few weeks after Rosa accepted Robert's offer had been challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. Some of the longtime staff members had resented taking orders from someone who had been cleaning toilets just days before. James, in particular, had struggled with the change in hierarchy, though he had eventually come to respect Rosa's natural leadership abilities. Robert had kept his word about changing the culture of fear in the household. He had sat down with each staff member individually to explain the new expectations. Mistakes were now treated as learning opportunities rather than firing offenses. Initiative was rewarded instead of punished. Most importantly, everyone was expected to prioritize the well-being of the family over protecting their own positions. The changes hadn't been limited to the staff. Robert himself had begun spending more time at home, often working from his home office instead of staying late at the company headquarters. He had started having dinner with Tommy every night, a practice that had been rare before the pool incident. Victoria had initially been skeptical of Rosa's promotion, but she had gradually warmed to the idea as she saw how much happier Tommy had become. The boy who had once wandered the mansion, like a lonely ghost, was now filled with energy and curiosity. Tommy had formed a special bond with both Rosa and Sophia. He had appointed himself as Sophia's big brother and protector, reading to her from picture books and making sure she always had her favorite toys nearby. The 8-year-old who had rarely smiled was now quick to laugh and eager to share stories about his day. But perhaps the most significant change was in Tommy's relationship with his father. Robert had begun teaching Tommy to swim, spending patient hours in the pool helping his son overcome the fear that had developed after his near-drowning experience. These swimming lessons had become a daily ritual that both father and son looked forward to. Rosa's new responsibilities had challenged her in ways she hadn't expected. Managing a household staff required diplomacy, organization, and the ability to solve problems quickly. But Robert had been right about her natural qualifications. Her experience as a single mother had taught her how to multitask, prioritize, and remain calm under pressure. The promotion had also opened up opportunities Rosa had never imagined possible. Robert had insisted that she take business management courses at the local community college, with the company paying for her tuition and textbooks. 2 evenings a week, Rosa attended classes while Victoria watched Sophia, an arrangement that had helped the two women develop a genuine friendship. Rosa had also been given a generous budget to improve working conditions for the entire staff. She had instituted regular breaks, improved the staff kitchen facilities, and created a more flexible scheduling system that allowed people to balance work with their personal lives. The changes had attracted positive attention from other wealthy families in the area. Word had spread about the Blackwood household's transformation, and several neighbors had approached Rosa about consulting on their own staff management challenges. Robert had encouraged these side projects, seeing them as valuable experience that would benefit his own household. On this particular afternoon, Rosa was reviewing applications for a new gardener position when Tommy burst into her office, his face bright with excitement. "Rosa, Dad said we can have a barbecue party this weekend, and I get to invite some kids from my tennis class. Can you help me plan it?" Rosa smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. 6 months ago, Tommy had rarely spoken above a whisper. Now he bubbled over with ideas and energy. "Of course we can plan a party," Rosa said. "What kind of food do you think your friends would like?" "Hamburgers and hot dogs, definitely. And can we have swimming? I want to show them how good I am at swimming now." Rosa felt a warm pride at Tommy's confidence in the pool. The boy who had nearly drowned was now one of the best swimmers in his age group at the local club. "Swimming sounds perfect. We'll make sure all the parents know to bring swimsuits." Tommy plopped down in the chair across from Rosa's desk, a casual gesture that would have been unthinkable in the old household regime. "Rosa, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why do you think the other people didn't help me when I fell in the pool?" Rosa had wondered when this question would come. Tommy was bright and observant, and she knew he had been thinking about that day. "Sometimes adults make things more complicated than they need to be," Rosa said carefully. "They were worried about making mistakes, so they forgot to focus on what was really important, which was helping me." "Exactly. Sometimes the most important thing is also the simplest thing." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "Dad told me that day taught him a lot about being a better father. What do you think about that?" "I think he was already a good father. He just forgot how to show it. Kind of like how I was always good at swimming. I just needed someone to teach me properly." Rosa was continually amazed by Tommy's insight. Living in an adult world had given him a maturity beyond his years. But Robert's increased attention and Rosa's warmth had allowed his childlike wonder to flourish alongside that wisdom. Sophia's babbling from the garden drew their attention to the window. The little girl was pulling herself up on a garden bench, determined to reach a colorful butterfly that had landed nearby. "She's getting so big," Tommy observed. "Do you think she'll remember that I was her first big brother when she gets older?" "I think she'll always remember how kind you've been to her," Rosa assured him. Robert appeared in the doorway of Rosa's office holding a folder of documents. The sight of his son chatting comfortably with Rosa while Sophia played nearby made him pause and smile. "Am I interrupting an important meeting?" Robert asked. "We're planning my party," Tommy announced. "Rosa said we can have hamburgers and swimming." "That sounds like an excellent plan. Rosa, do you have a few minutes to discuss the Henderson account?" The Henderson account was one of several business projects where Robert had begun asking for Rosa's input. Her practical perspective and ability to see situations from multiple angles had proven valuable in negotiations and planning. "Tommy, why don't you go check on Sophia while your father and I talk business?" Rosa suggested. Tommy hopped up eagerly. "Can I push her on the baby swing?" "Very gently," Rosa cautioned, and Tommy ran off to the garden. Robert took the seat Tommy had vacated and spread out the documents on Rosa's desk. Over the months, these informal business discussions had become a regular occurrence. Robert had discovered that Rosa's lack of formal business training was actually an advantage in some situations, allowing her to see solutions that more experienced advisors missed. "The Hendersons want to modify the terms of their contract," Robert explained. "They're asking for a lower initial payment in exchange for a higher percentage of long-term profits." Rosa studied the numbers, applying the analytical skills she had been developing in her business classes. "It seems like they're betting on the project being more successful than even they initially projected. Why would they want to tie their own profits to ours unless they were very confident?" Robert nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I was thinking. It suggests they have information about market conditions that we might not have considered." These conversations had become one of the most rewarding aspects of Rosa's new position. Robert treated her as an intellectual equal, valuing her opinions and insights. It was a far cry from the scared housekeeper who had worried about breaking a $20 vase. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Robert said, putting the business documents aside. "I've been thinking about making some changes to Tommy's education." "What kind of changes?" "Right now he's being tutored at home, but I'm wondering if he might benefit from attending a regular school. Being around other children his age, participating in normal childhood activities." Rosa considered this carefully. "What does Tommy think about the idea?" "I haven't asked him yet. I wanted to get your opinion first." The fact that Robert was asking for her input on such an important parenting decision showed how much their relationship had evolved. Rosa no longer saw herself as just an employee, and Robert no longer treated her like one. "I think Tommy would thrive in a school environment," Rosa said thoughtfully. "He's naturally social and curious. The structure might be good for him, and making friends his own age would help him develop in ways that adult tutoring can't provide. My concern is security. There have been some threats against the company lately, nothing serious, but enough to make me cautious about Tommy being in public spaces. What if we found a private school with excellent security, somewhere that serves other families in similar situations?" Robert nodded slowly. "That might work. Would you be willing to research some options?" "Of course. I'll put together a list of schools that might be appropriate." Through the window, they could see Tommy carefully pushing Sophia on the baby swing, talking to her in the animated way he had developed when explaining the world to his little sister. "He's become a different child," Robert observed, following Rosa's gaze. "You've become a different father," Rosa replied. "Children respond to the energy around them." Robert was quiet for a moment, watching his son and Sophia play together. "Rosa, I want you to know that what you did that day didn't just save Tommy's life. It saved our family. You did that yourself, Mr. Blackwood. You were willing to change when you saw that change was needed. Call me Robert." "I think we're past formal titles, don't you?" Rosa smiled. "I suppose we are." As the afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, Rosa reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a struggling single mother cleaning houses for minimum wage. Now she was managing a household staff, taking business classes, consulting for other families, and helping to raise a boy who had become like a son to her. But more than the professional success, Rosa treasured the relationships that had developed. Tommy's trust and affection, Sophia's secure happiness, and Robert's respect and friendship had created a family dynamic she had never expected to find. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the garden as Tommy and Sophia continued their play. It was a sound that had been missing from the Blackwood mansion for too long, but which now filled the house with warmth and life. Rosa had learned that sometimes the most extraordinary changes come from the simplest acts of courage. A moment of decision by a pool had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. And as she watched the man who had once terrified his own staff now gently teaching his son to be brave and kind, Rosa knew that the best changes were still to come.